Welcome back everyone, and welcome to episode 10, where we cover off a few other miscellaneous functions. Now what we're trying to do here is simply wrap up a few of the more commonly used functions and functions that allow you to solve a certain SQL problem when you get to that stage. So these are the three that we'll be covering off: the pivot and the unpivot, the immediate if function, and the concat, which is short for concatenate. So let's head on in to SQL Server Management Studio and have a look at these functions. Okay, so a neat little thing that we can do before we even log in to SQL Server itself, if we click in the options here, and you can see under Connection Properties, make sure you're on that tab, we'll see here Connect to Database, and it's defaulted to Master there. What we can do is click on Wide World Importers, for example, and if you don't have that, you'll need to browse or just simply type it out manually. So let's have a look at that, and we'll hit Connect. Now that will store the connection to database. As you can see here, it's always set to Master. Let's connect to that, and then when we fire up a new query, you can see straight away it changes to Wide World Importers, so we don't really need to be connecting to that database all the time. That's a nice little trick for you. Let's close that down, and we'll go into the lesson itself. There we go, and we're already in our database. Brilliant. So we're going to have a look at the pivot function first of all, and pivoting is all about denormalizing data. So what do we mean by normalizing and denormalizing data? Well, normally in a database, or particularly in a data warehousing, we like to store data in a normalized format. What that means is that you have very few columns, and then you have rows and rows and rows of data. Now the idea is that you don't have to go in and amend that table all the time. You simply insert rows as you go, regardless of when you're doing that, what data needs to go in. So if we have a look at this table, for example, all I'm doing is simply getting your customer ID, the year of the order date, and then putting a quantity and a unit price against the total order amount, and we get the data as you can see there. So obviously for customer 1, 2013, and we get one amount there, and we can go on 2014, 15 and 16, and we know from working with the Wide World Importers database, it only has data for those 4 years there. But what would happen if suddenly they started ordering in 2017 and data started coming in? Well, you could just simply insert another row into this table, and that's pretty much what it's all about when it comes to normalized data, simply adding rows as you go. Now what if we wanted to actually see the data in this format here? So what you'd normally see on Excel, or maybe a report over the past 4 years, etc. Because as humans, we're more used to reading data in this format, so from left to right. So we can see with customer 1, he's got about 80,000 in sales there, and then he went up to 105 in 2014. So you can see, as a comparison purpose, there's a big increase there, and another increase there in 2015, but then a drop in 2016. So we as humans normally read data quite easily in this method here. So when it comes to pivoting or denormalizing data, which is kind of like the structure here, that's what we'd normally do for, say, a reporting purpose, or if someone wants an extract on a spreadsheet, they'll probably normally want to see the data in this format here, as opposed to this one here, because as far as humans go, it's a bit less readable. It's a bit trickier to see exactly what's going on here. You and I are probably used to it by now because we've been analyzing data over the period of this course, so we know what's going on here. But someone who's not very data savvy or database used to working with databases might struggle a bit in gleaning the required information from this normalized data. So we'd want to then pivot it, as the name implies, to get the format here. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first of all, I'm going to put everything into an orders table, a temporary table, because I'm going to be using the data going forwards for quite a few examples in this video. However, of course, you can use a CTE or a subselect or even a temporary table to get the data that you need in order to pivot. You may not even need to create a temporary table, etc., and you can bring it in directly into your code. But what I'm going to do is put it all into a table called orders. So as we saw from our results, this data here is going to go into this orders table, this temporary table here. So let's run that off, and we've got our data in 2,585 rows. Brilliant stuff. So now we can go and pivot it to get this format here. So how do we go about doing that then? Well, fortunately, SQL Server's given us a handy little function there, pivot, but it takes quite a little bit to get our head around, and we're going to be using the orders table here, as we've created here, inserted rows into that, just to make it a little bit easier to focus on what's going on with the pivot itself. We're going to call it O, and with the pivot function, you of course have to start off with your from table that you're going to be extracting data from and then pivoting that data. So it looks like a normal query here. We're going to call that O. So what we're going to do is we're going to then put underneath, instead of any inner joins, etc., we're going to write the function pivot there. Then we're going to open the brackets, and then we're going to start writing our pivot. Now, with the pivot, it requires two distinct clauses within. So as you can see here, we're using an aggregate function. I'm using sum because what I'm doing is simply adding up all the values within the total order amount. Now we know from looking at our data here, if I run that off again very quickly, you can see that we don't really need to have already summed there, so we're getting a total order amount anyway. However, the pivot function still requires us to sum or count distinct or min or max, etc., in order for it to function. So if we didn't sum those up, we'd be summing them up in there. As it is, it would just be summing of the one value anyway. So we do need to put an aggregate function starting off there, and then this is the column that we're going to aggregate on. Now this will be the values that get put in here. So this bit here is all about the values that are going to go into your actual columns against each row. The next bit is how we're going to go about building up our columns. So as you can see here, we've got 2013, 14, 15 and 16. We're going to then say 4 and then the order year. As you can see, here's the order year in, then open our brackets, and then we're going to manually put in the actual column names that we're going to call it, separated by a column, by a comma there. So we're going to be pulling 2013, 14, 15. If we just wanted to pull 2013 and 14, we could simply leave those off like that. But then, obviously, we'd need to change our code here, which is fine, as you can see. So if we just wanted to see 2013 and 14, we could do just that by specifying in the for area here, within the in brackets. So this is the array that we're going to use. We simply just specify the exact columns that we want to pull. It's 2013, 14, 15, 16, so we're going to pull a lot, and hopefully we end up with something like that. And you still need to give that a pseudonym, as always, after you've closed your brackets, closing off your pivot statement there. We're going to call it P for pivot, and then that is what you're going to return there. So you could have multiple other columns. As you can see, our customer ID is there, pulling across, and then we're pulling these 4 columns from within our for array there. So whatever you create here, you can then pull over here. As you can see, the pseudonym is P for our pivot, as opposed to O. So this orders table, our from bit here, is simply just to grab hold of the data to begin doing our pivot, which is in our orders table. Of course, you could have put all this code here in here instead, but obviously it gets maybe a little bit messy, so you could use that as a subselect or as a CTE and then bring it in like this, depending on how you want to do that. And we'll look at a few different ways, different examples of doing that in an example below. But that pretty much gives us our pivoted data. So the tricky part, of course, is writing your pivot. So you need an aggregate function, and the column from your orders table here that you're going to be using to form your values. As you can see there, let's put those pseudonyms in correctly, make it a bit more clear. And then, of course, in the next bit on the for, you start building up your columns, and you make sure you select the ones that you want only. So let's run that off. Again, I'm going to put it into another temporary table there. And we've got 663 rows. So we know we've got 663 customers, so we've got 663 rows. If we run that off, as you can see, our data is looking just like it is here. And we get the results for every customer ID, 663 rows. So that is simply turning your normalized data from what looks like a more of a vertical form into denormalized format, which looks more horizontal in aspect. So we can pivot that data. And that's all it is with the pivot functionality. You've got to just remember how to go about creating your bit here. So I think you can give an example a try. Let's look at this scenario, and it's a scenario that we've had before in a previous video where we used a different function to get these values here to form this whole thing. But what we're going to do is we're going to use exactly the same example, and we're instead going to use our pivot in order to do that. And I'll show you the different ways of writing the code for that. So if you fancy giving that a go, and it doesn't matter how you bring the data in a subselect or a CTE, or even if you use temporary tables like I've done here, it's all up to you how you want to go about doing that. But the first thing, of course, is to create your data that you're going to work with, and then second of all, build your pivot table there. So give that a try. If you're keen, simply pause the video, and when you're ready, we'll move on with my example. Alright then, let's begin. First of all, we'll build up our query to get all this data. Customer name, let's head on into our database. And our customer name is in our sales customers. And we need a customer category. Whereabouts is he? Supplier categories, customer categories, there we go. Running from us, we're going to call it A. Customer category ID. Customer category ID. There we have it. Let's bring those in quickly. Category name. Okay, so we've got our two columns first of all, and we need to then bring in total invoice amounts, and of course we need to bring in the years as we see here. So the invoice amounts, that's all from the invoicing tables, so let's bring those in as well. So with everything, as you can see, we just build up a simple query to begin with, and then we can use that for further functionality. Oh, jump the gun a bit there. Already. And of course we need sales invoice lines, because that's where all our invoice amounts are. Invoice ID equals the invoice ID there. So we've got all that together. Let's build up those other lines. So we want the invoice date, and that's a year function. We're just going to call it year. There you go. And then we need the totals, which is going to be a sum of the invoice amounts, because we know that invoice lines has got several lines per invoice, so we need to sum that one up. So let's do just that. Let's have a look at that table very quickly, see which columns we need to pull. We'll just use the extended price in this example. Now it doesn't matter if you times the unit price by the quantity, got your extended price, you add your tax, it doesn't really matter which way you did it. Main thing is to make sure you've got that pivot function done well. So we're going to use that, and of course we're going to sum it to get our total. Then we need to group by all the other columns that do not have an aggregate function assigned, and there we have it. I'm going to leave that off for now and run that off. There we go. So we know that for every single customer name there. We have their customer category, the year, and the total that they ordered for that year. So we've got our data that we're going to work with, that we're going to pivot with, and we've got all these different values there that we're going to pivot with the invoice amounts popping up as values. So let's start off and use this as a sub-select. First of all, as we know with a sub-select, very easy to write it out. But then we've got to call it something. We'll just give it a pseudonym of A in there. And then we've got to write our lovely pivot. So what are we going to do? How are we going to go about doing this? Well, first of all, we need our aggregate. So in this case, again, we're using sum, and of course you could use count, etc. if you just wanted to count the amount of entries, and we're counting bringing in the total, because that's going to form the basis for all our values in each column and in each row. And then we need to put the for order year. We've got here year here, and we can simply just grab this code here, put it in there. As P. Now, if we leave it at that, and we simply run the code off, there you can see it returns the data as we want it. And of course, we've got a null in there. So that's pretty much it, pivoted. However, they wanted to see it in this order, and of course they can, if you send it to them on a spreadsheet, they can move things around. But what we'll do is we'll put it in the right order for them. It'll be nice to know. As you can see, customer category and customer name, they aren't within our pivoting function because we want to pivot just the total and the year and then bring it in for each customer. And we'll bring 2016 there. So it doesn't matter what order you build your columns in here, you can change it when you do your bit here. Or you can leave it at select star because it's returning everything there. But one thing you'll notice is that even with the select star, and let's do that again and run that off, one thing you'll notice is that it didn't return the data from A, as if we'd selected everything from A, so it never returned these values here. It only returned the pivoted data, P itself, because it knows that because the data does not line up now, you've got normalized data and then you've got denormalized data in your pivot function, you can't line them up and display them together, so it will only display your pivoted value there. And if we run that off again, we get it in the order specified. And of course we can do this now on all of these columns, as you remember from previous examples. To make sure we put in a 0 instead of a null. Of course you could put them on all the other columns if you choose to do so. It'd be a good idea to do that, and you'll get your pivoted values there. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy enough. Obviously you're doing all the hard work here with the summing, etc., but you could of course do it in here as well. So that's as a sub-select. If you wanted it as a CTE instead, if that's the way you did it, then you will simply put it in like such, or you could have done it similar to these temporary tables, but that's the different ways of doing the same thing. And that's pretty much it for the pivot function. Another example for you there, for you to work through and get your head around it there. Now, the thing to note with the pivot function is it can be quite resource intensive, and it can chew a lot of the SQL Server CPU memory when it runs off that functionality. So there are alternatives that we can use that may actually perform considerably quicker from there, and that is of course doing some sub-selects within the columns themselves. So you've got your select, your total amount from orders as O1, customer ID equals customer ID, so we're joining to itself, so we're pulling the total amount from the orders table, and then we're joining it on the outer select to itself and just pulling the customer ID from O. But then we're saying customer ID is customer ID, and we're specifying the order year is 2013 as 2013. So we're going to pull the data for these 4 different years here, and getting the customer ID from orders here, specifying it as O. So as you can see, we can use the same table multiple times in a single select statement in order to get the data we want and put it in the order that we want. So we'll have a look at that versus our pivot and see what we get from there. Let's bring that up. And there you can see we get pretty much similar data. However, we can see that it's duplicated as well, because we've got 4 years, so we've got 4 rows for each line, but they're exactly the same there. So just simply put a distinct in there, and we're pretty much good to go. Let's run that off again, and there you have exactly the same thing. So 2 ways to do this, and in fact we had other methods, other windowed functions, etc., to do the same thing. So it all depends how you want to do this, what your skill level is, if you needed to produce data in a normalized form like so. Up to you how you want to go about doing it. Sometimes this method here, even though it's got these inline sub-selects, can be a lot faster than using the actual pivot itself, which can be a bit slower. So depends how you want to do it. Check how quick your query is running. If it's quick enough using the pivot or another function, then fine. If not, maybe you could try using this method here. Now we've had a look at pivot, a couple of alternatives there in order to denormalize our data. What happens if we have denormalized data and we want to then normalize it, putting a whole lot of columns in a more of a horizontal format back into more of a vertical format? Well, we know we've got the pivot data in this temporary table here. We can simply use the unpivot command to change it round. So start off again with our table we're pulling from, and then our unpivot command will unpivot the data there. Now you'll notice straight away our unpivot functionality is slightly different to the pivot in the way it's written, in so much that we don't have an aggregate function in there. And this is because we're simply taking the data out of pivot, or pivoted table here, and we're actually, all we're doing is renaming the columns. So the order amount, let's extract that quickly for you. Our order amounts, we know, are these values in here. So we need to actually give them a name of a column that we're going to put all these values into. So we're going to call that total order amount. And then of course, for our order year are going to be all our columns. So 2013, 14, 15, 16. What our columns are actually named as, we're going to have to actually rename a column or create a column there. We're going to call it order year, and then we're going to put those values in there. So unlike the pivot, where you're actually getting data and pivoting them into specific columns, what we're doing here is we're actually creating new columns, and we're putting these values in there, and we're putting these columns in there as well. So all we're doing here with the unpivot is renaming those columns, and then we're going to use the unpivot function to actually put the values in there. So let's see how that goes. And there you have it, customer 1, order year, and his value there, going to customer 2, and so on. So that's all that the unpivot does, is it takes pivoted data and normalizes it as such. That's it for the pivot and the unpivot. We're going to wrap up the video there, so you can keep your mind on the pivot and unpivot, and then in the next video we'll sweep up the final 2 functions for you. Till then, have a great day everyone.